My daughter Kate gave me a book called, it was by the chief usher at the White House, and it was his memoir, and she handed it to me and said, "Here, Mom, this is about the first woman president." So I was curious. I had finished a biography of Abigail Adams, and I was beginning to research a book on John Quincy Adams, because I was absolutely enamored of the Adams family, and couldn't think of which one I wanted to do more. And before Edith Wilson and after, he died early on, and I can't remember when, but his memoir was published posthumously. And so I've forgotten how many presidents he covered, but a lot, I think. Well, he had his account, of the night that Wilson fell ill. That was quite different than Edith Wilson's. I had then gone and read her memoir, and it was quite different, enough so that I went and got out his original papers. And there the account was definite, that there was no one telling it properly about what had happened that night, and so he thought he would tell his version of it. And she minded terribly. Well, there were other, as I read on, she made a lot of other differences. She made up a lot of stories along the way, and her versions varied considerably from what I found to be the truth of the versions when I went to the original papers. She claimed that her husband was just as alive and alert after this attack, and that it wasn't serious at all. And of course, the doctors say that he had a stroke that made him unable to govern properly. And then what my luck really came, and I call it luck, it was very sad to find out that about 10 years ago, the original diagnoses were handed over to, or handed in to Professor Link, who had been the editor of the 69 volumes of Wilson's papers. And the original diagnoses were that this man was unalterably wounded by his stroke and unable to govern. But Mrs. Wilson prevented these diagnoses from being made public. And so by that one stroke, Dr. Grayson was co-opted into what she perceived as a nervous breakdown. That was thought to be more respectable than a stroke. He was from 1912 to 21. I thought he was looked on as quite a hero. I think until it came to his illness and entering in World War I and the peace conference. And then he wasn't well even in Paris. And he also was almost a naive American in Paris, as Clemenceau looked at him and David Lloyd George. He didn't understand the complications in the history of, or he thought, he was so idealistic, he thought everything could be overcome, and it couldn't. And then, of course, he was ill, and he listened to no one, you know. What was the country like? He was interested in banking system. He was interested in all kinds of political problems that he might solve. There were railroad problems. There were what else can I say about him? He was a thoughtful president, and he was a sensitive man, although it was rather a dour presidency, you realize, because his wife became very ill during that time, and it was not an open White House, but he was thought to be a very endearing father and father to the 3 girls, and a very entertaining man. But then his first wife died, you know, in August of 1914. Yes. Almost the days we went to war. Germany invaded Belgium. Well, I think he thought it was. From what I read, every Wilsonian is going to be very angry at me, but I didn't admire his writing especially. And I thought he was very wordy pretentious in his writing. I think what made him a hero is adopting this philosophy of one world that we could have in the League, and that fired him. At Princeton, he had a problem about accepting funds that would permit building taking an off-campus site for the graduate students. He wanted it all together, which was an ideal thing, but the money wasn't given this way, and so he turned his back on it. It was $250,000, and he was simply angry beyond belief that people did not go along with his ideas. And so I think he was very glad when he was tapped to be governor, and I think that he was really quite a hero at the time when he didn't fall in with all the political machinery that existed, and he was quite independent. And I think that he went along that way until, and he was just fine until he sort of, I think, overreached. And he was warned against going abroad, but he very much wanted to do that. Well, he went abroad for the peace conference, and he left, was it 1918, December 1918, and he meant to be the hero of the conference and to lead us all into peace. He didn't want to go, you know, into World War I, but I think the usual channels. The Brits needed help, the French needed help, and the French had helped us in the Revolutionary War. And so, and there were people who were very anti-German in this country, and there were people who were very pro-German. But eventually, he had no, and for example, Teddy Roosevelt was very angry with him, but he wanted to, he was elected partially because he would maintain peace, but he didn't maintain peace, and finally declared war when there was enough pressure on him to do so. Ellen Axon Wilson, and that was a true love affair of a very young man and a very young woman, and she was very intelligent. She was very educated for her time, and she was an artist, and some of her paintings have been on exhibit at the Wilson house here on S Street. And she translated German for him. She was helpful, a wonderful helpmate all the way, and I think quite a wise woman, and very eager. She was quite taunted because she's very interested in helping the poor and writing the slums and so on. That is a very sad picture of the two of them, and there is an interim correspondence that Wilson had with a woman named Mary Peck, and how much of an influence it was on their marriage, I don't know. But I think she at that point had somewhat of a nervous breakdown herself, and her family were very frail. Her brother was frail, and so I think that Wilson, in his great need to pour out his heart to someone, wrote these extensive letters to this Mary Peck, and there was great, during both campaigns, it was a problem to him. Bright's disease, kidney ailment, and she died, I think it was just the day, was it August 3rd? I can't remember, but just the day that the Germans invaded Belgium. And so she went, and then what happened was that by March, he had met his second wife, Edith. She's standing, she's a plump lady. Yes, she's in back of Mark Twain. Can you see her at all? And she looks a little plump, and apparently had almost like a salon in Bermuda. She was very unhappily married for the second time, and very attractive. Her correspondence is quite exuberant for a long time, and very supportive of him. That's at Princeton. At Princeton and at the Library of Congress. There's more of his letters to her. I've forgotten the proportion, but they exist. She's been a footnote. She's been sort of a pain to historians. They tend to, if they acknowledge her at all, it's in the tiniest type at the bottom of the page. But other than that, they don't. Or there's the other side of the coin when they'll say, there was a true physical relationship, and I don't know that that's true at all. Well, he met her in 1907, and oddly enough, when he went on his, well, and then the correspondence petered out, and it came to an end when he, not an end, but it dwindled radically when he met and married Edith Wilson. But he did stop when he made a tour of the country on behalf of the League of Nations, trying to sell his 14-point. He did stop in Los Angeles and ask Mary Peck to come to lunch and introduce her to Edith Wilson. So there was some sentimental connection for all, I think, his life. Whatever the depth of it was, I don't know. But he had great need of her. That's interesting. It was impassioned as a young man to Ellen, and it was most becoming, excuse me, when he was a young man. There was never such a lover as I, that kind of thing, to his first wife. And then with Mary Peck, it was more confessional. The days were so long for him, there was nothing interesting about the presidency. I'd like to think he wasn't really truly sincere, or how lonesome he was because his wife, was so lonely in the White House and that sort of thing. It was so confessional. I didn't quite understand how this president could have the time and the patience or the need to lean on this lady so much. And she was the wife. He was married to a proper, I think he was a manufacturer in Williamstown, New York, quite prosperous. She had lived abroad when her first husband died. I think she spoke French, and she had quite a worldly outlook, and apparently she was very attractive in Bermuda when Wilson went alone. He was always recovering from kind of little semi-nervous breakdowns. When the tension was too much, he would have to go away. And when there was a problem at Princeton, he went off in 1907 to Bermuda to recuperate, and met her there, and quite admired her, and struck up this almost lifelong friendship. Well, I don't know how often, let's see, but 4 or 5 times. Well, I think he felt that it was a refuge for him, and he honestly loved it. And his wife Ellen understood his nature, and he just needed to recuperate, and he needed peace, and he needed solitude in a way. And that was part. He was a very nervous, sensitive man, and if crossed, he just couldn't tolerate any kind of dissension, as far as I could see, reading these letters so closely as I did. Yes, he stood for what he stood for, and you were right. You thought you were right, and therefore you were right. And also, these were not men who had great, I don't know as Nixon leaned on anybody for real advice. I think he probably was quite a singular man, and I think, in a way, this man was quite the same kind of personality. Certainly, I don't mean the darkness of the Nixon as I have followed him through the years. I don't mean that, but the one man he was close to, Colonel House, there was a closeness, but it was not. There was not the depth of closeness there. And I don't know anyone else he was close to except his the women, and that he seemed to have more of an affinity for. Colonel House was a Texan of some wealth, who had ambitions politically, but felt somehow he wasn't strong enough to pursue them, and was introduced to Wilson, and the two of them thought alike as far as the League went, and had great aspirations and idealized and ideals. And Edith Wilson, unfortunately, was immediately put off by the relationship. And it eventually founded, perhaps when Wilson needed someone to temper his ideas. He came, he would stay overnight. They welcomed him at lunch. They took carriage rides together. And they really both had the same idea in mind. It would be wonderful for the world to unite in the name of peace and to get all the nations together. And it had been an idea that had been floating around for some time, adopted and sponsored by many, but certainly a number of people. And to Wilson's credit, he grasped it completely, and House really fortified his dreams. He went abroad a little bit. He was kind of the eyes and ears for this man for a long time. But Edith immediately painted him as a weak vessel and didn't really like him and wasn't comfortable with him, and then eventually developed a case against him, and he was out of the picture completely. Dr. Grayson, his physician, was in love with the young woman Edith had traveled with, and I think, and he knew Edith very well, and I couldn't trace this. He knew Edith when he was an intern, and it may be that he had known her when she gave birth to her child. She had a son by her first marriage, and who didn't live. And I think he had his eyes on Edith, thinking she might cheer the president up, because he was really in the depths of despair, and the White House was just the most gloomy place in the world. And as described by his brother-in-law, they just sort of sat around and reminisced about what old times had been. At any rate, Dr. Grayson then persuaded Edith Galt, as she was known, to come and meet the cousin of Wilson's. Her name was Helen Bones. And then there is this picture of the two ladies having tea, and in came Wilson and Grayson, I guess from a ride of the golf course, and he was immediately taken with Edith Wilson, who in her memoir says she was glad she was wearing a marvelous French outfit, and so I think he invited her immediately to come back for dinner, and it was a done deal. Ellen had died in August, and they were introduced in March. Very important part of the book, because he carried on Edith's message. I think, I can't remember quite, but were there 30 announcements of how, after he had his stroke, of how it was just a nervous breakdown and he was getting better and he would soon be better and so on, and he wasn't getting better. Dr. Grayson had turned in a diagnosis that said that he was irrevocably wounded by this stroke. But I think Edith must have been such an alluring creature that she sort of co-opted Dr. Grayson to be part of this whole, what shall I say, stage this whole thing that meant he was well. The major stroke was in October, I think October 6th, October 3rd, 1919. And that was when he was found on the floor on the bed, and that was the stroke that was really such a radical stroke that there were many consultants, maybe 4 or 5 were brought in. Dr. Grayson was quite a good doctor. First, I was suspicious of him. He was very well trained, and I thought maybe he didn't diagnose things well because he didn't have the background, but he did. He had had good schooling, and he was very, very bright. And with that, at some point immediately, he and a Dr. Durkheim, who was also an outstanding doctor, wrote this analysis, and then Edith and Dr. Grayson read it to Edith Wilson, and she said that was not the way it was to be. And so from then on, if you look at the Times, which I did, you follow them through the boxes, the New York Times, daily came out. I was just looking for some water, but, oh, thank you. Then it was always a nervous breakdown. He would get better. Oh, I worked on and off from, let's see, about 1950, something like that, on and off. I had, between all my children, and I kept going back, and they kept having me back, but I just couldn't, the pace of it, which I adored, was not conducive to being where I needed to be. Well, my byline at the beginning was Phyllis Lee Levin. It wasn't a famous one, but we were all on the women's page. It was called 4Fs, Food, Family, Fashion, and Furnishings. When I finally, the last time I wrote for them was for the travel section, a number of times, and it's probably more like 15, 20 years ago. So that's my fourth. Well, the first book I did came out of my 4F experience, and it was called The Wheels of Fashion. And I did profiles on Richard Avedon and Deanne Breland. It was the first time that we had dignified the, you know, the fashion industry and the marvelous talents that there were there. And the second was on historic houses, and that's where I found I had to write about Adam's family and Quincy, and fell in love with Abigail. And that was my great romance. So I loved writing about them, and I spent days at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and really would have gone on with them forever until Edith and Woodrow came along. I think I've told you that this morning I spoke at the Wilson House on S Street, and there was one gentleman who was in love. Well, not in love, but he really admired him to pieces. And Edith and Professor Link, and he really took great objection to what I'd written. And in my defense, I can only say that I had documented. I didn't expect to find all the material. I don't know why others didn't look at the documents and see her name over everything and not think that was important. He was the editor-in-chief of the 69 volumes of the papers of Woodrow Wilson, published by Princeton University. He died just a few years ago, and he felt that it had been a God-given assignment, and he truly admired Wilson and gave a great deal of his life to it. And he sat on the 5th floor of the Firestone Library and lived with great dignity, and various staff members came and went, and tea was served at 11 and 3. I doubt if there's such a gentlemanly, scholarly corner anywhere else on earth. I commuted there for 3 weeks, and I had he was not so anxious to have me. He had jurisdiction over 2 important papers, Dr. Grayson's and Professor Axon, Ellen's brother. And so I tried very hard to see those, and at first he was very put off. He didn't think they were important, and I mustered up enough courage to say that would be for me to decide. And so he was gentlemanly enough to receive me. And then it turned out that a lot of people didn't acknowledge his scholarship and went off and pretended it was their own. And so I assured him I would, and I sent him a copy of Abigail Adams, which is extravagantly noted. And so then he was very accepting, and so I had a little office there, or a desk, for 3 weeks, and worked away at what I needed to. And then the papers, the state documents, are all in the Library of Congress, but they're also on microfilm at the Graduate Center in New York City, which was very nice for me. So that's where I found all her signatures. And I found a lot of wonderful press coverage, a lot of women reporters in those days, which are a lot more than I would have bargained for, and very discerning. No, not really. You know, I don't mean to be negative, but anything like that came to ruffle the Princeton papers was always put in the finest print. So only if you were me, you'd go through the appendix, you'd go look at the letters, and you'd see in the left-hand corner the initials, inferring that they were in someone else's handwriting. If, as a secretary wrote some things for them, they'd JPTH or E well, Edith B.W.H. And so that was the only way. Otherwise, everything was you know, looked very straightforward. So, well, immediately after that was immediately what happened, and he must have fallen on the floor of the bathroom and cut his head, though, according to Hoover, but Edith Wilson said she never saw that blood. But what she did do was call Hoover to call Grayson to come immediately, and Hoover and Grayson came immediately, opened the door, came out, made some motion as if to say, you know, something's happened, and that was it. And then no one was able to see him. Tumulty, the secretary for 3 weeks, the stenographer for 2 months, and but what Grayson did do was call a conference, and a very respectable group of physicians came to analyze what was wrong with them. And those are all, that they came, yes, that he called them, and that they were, but the doctors themselves, the only two original documents were the ones in 91, were the ones. The two by Dr. Durkheim and Dr. Grayson giving the exact diagnosis of 1919 were only seen 70 years later. Those you see, and those are printed in the book as well, in fine print in the appendix. Yes, there were, but very few. It seemed to be a gentleman's agreement that you didn't question things. There were a couple of newspapers. There was something called the War Weekly, and they wondered after a time, after several months, where he was, because you see, he wasn't seen until March. The League of Nations then that's why this was so important, because the votes were being taken in the Senate. And Henry Cabot Lodge, who at some point, you know, he has been dismissed and so tarred and feathered as such the evil. It's a but for him we would have joined the League of Nations, and that really isn't true. He was a very, very bright, intelligent man. I read all of his correspondence at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he was in favor of a league at one point. He was in favor of some compromise. There's evidence of that. But Wilson, I think one thing, he didn't know how unlucky he would be with his thing. He could not get anyone to see that he had to compromise, and I think Edith made one stab, and then he's, according to her, said, "Little girl, you too," as if she was betraying him. And so that was the end of it. And my feeling was, had he been married to Ellen Wilson, he might have, well, I don't think she would have allowed him to stay in office being so ill. I don't think she could have been party to such a vast, what was it, sort of a pantomime. Well, he wanted them attached, and that was a great aggravating point in that, so that the Versailles Treaty, that the whole idea was held up because he insisted that the 14 points be part of everything, and he would not give an inch on it. And when it came then to they had signed the Versailles Treaty, but when it came to the League, he just couldn't let go. And so when it came, the crucial point was when the Democrats asked him how to vote. If they voted for compromise, would he allow them to vote for a compromise? And he said no. And so that was, after several attempts, that was the end of the League. And then I think he thought he had to run for the third term. He'd have to run for president again to champion his league, as sick as he was. So it's a very strange way to feel, and very sad. They all came after. He had the stroke in October, and then all the voting took place the following months. And he was not out front. And and there was a Gilbert Hitchcock, who was the Democrat, who seemed to be his representative, and there was all sorts of maneuvering and private meetings. And then poor Colonel House was writing to him to And various people came by, Bernard Baruch and different people came by, or wrote, I should say, to ask him to please make the compromise with Lodge, because it wouldn't matter. The small points could be ironed out, and the big point was for us to have a league that he so wanted. And I don't think he was well enough to understand, although a corner of me feels that he had been so stubborn in the Princeton era over where the graduate center would be, that he might have stuck to his guns on this. Apparently it was just brilliantly laid. I think that what they did, they covered his arm. It was his right arm that was paralyzed. And I think, you know, the cover is a deception as well. Because, well, that's another story. That was taken by a Times, that story, that was posed to show that Wilson was well enough to run for the third term. So that's what his right hand was paralyzed, I think. And it must have been. I'd forgotten. But that was the scene, and they both thought he was very bright. The lights were lowered, and Dr. Grayson stood in the room, and Mrs. Wilson was in the room, and everybody stood at attention. And Mrs. Wilson took notes there in the library, because she didn't trust Fallen at all to be honest, and she was worried about what they would report, and he apparently pulled it off, and the press gave Wilson high marks. So that I think that, of course, the Congress was so suspicious that it was on the pretext that what to do about Mexico. We were always having a problem in Mexico, but what should we do about Mexico? But the pretext was to send this little, as I think it was called, a fishing expedition. Well, that of course is the important question. What was it, in 1906? He had some sort of a problem, and he lost the sight in one eye, and he never gained his sight again. And then certainly in Paris, I shouldn't say certainly, but from all that I have read, there were two doctors who turned up, and they both claimed that they were there on social visit. A Dr. Thewlis and another doctor. These are good men with good credentials, but I think Dr. Grayson must have been worried and sent for them. And it came out that there again he'd had a form of a stroke. And then in July, he was bundled onto the SS Washington, and it was thought to hide him because then again he had suffered another episode, as we say. So he was sick, and of course you have to realize that when he was at college, he was at Davidson, and he left. He felt the wear and tear made him so nervous, and then he went to Princeton, and then he was at Johns Hopkins and at the University of Virginia, and he never really seemed to, he always needed to finish his papers on his own time. But, you know, this morning it came out, he kept the flame alive, the flame of a united world. One of the things I do think is that Mrs. Wilson and President Wilson chose his biographer brilliantly at Baker. And I think that perpetuated his reputation, embellished it, and then, of course, you remember the film that was made. That was made word for word from her book, and she had total control over it. If you read the papers of the correspondence between the producer, the director, and herself. And so they all showed her, you know, Geraldine Fitzgerald made her, and Alexander Knox was Mr. Wilson, and it was all just a beautiful story. And the only thing that was wrong was Henry Cabot Lodge. 1936 or 1937. I believe she started it because Mary Peck had published her memoir as a magazine serial, and Mrs. Wilson, it was suggested that Mrs. Wilson was so angry that she claimed that she wrote her memoir on the train and everywhere, and it does. So she did scraps and scraps of it, and she got very, very angry and used very bad language in her diary and in her initial volume of this letter. And then Bernard Baruch had a very renowned journalist named Marcus James come and look at it, and he did, and he said, "This is yours, and you must keep your spirit in it." And so that was published. So I think she's been the great publicist for her husband. He was a New York financier, and he had a very special affection for Woodrow Wilson, whom he admired very, very much. And Mrs. Wilson enjoyed him very much. He was affluent, he was extremely generous to her, provided wonderful weekends, a trip around the world, a fur piece, was very protective of her, and also bought the property next to the S Street house to protect their privacy at one point. And she shopped a good deal before she settled on that house, and they fixed it all over. I think the Stanton house, I think the people credit her with its existence, actually, and she got a lot of support from Bernard Baruch and a number of Princeton friends. And if you read her papers, there wasn't a detail. I don't think there was a fringe that went up on a curtain that she didn't supervise as a memorial to her husband. Well, I think that people then say his idea came that much later. The other thing, of course, is to think that if we had joined the League of Nations, the First World War, maybe we wouldn't have been into the Second World War so soon as we were, and maybe everything would have happened in a different way. Of course, that's second guessing. At the beginning, I think his dreams were all just perfect, and at the end, I think he gave in on a number of things, certainly on that issue, and that is the crux of everybody's issue. And House was extremely worried by that arrangement. He went in December 1918. He came back in February for a Senate meeting. I think he would sell his whole plan, 14 points, and then he went back. He was just here a week, and he turned around and went back again. And then he came back in June. That is partially my problem with her. You would think she was the first, she was one of the first women to own an automobile. She was somewhat of a Edith Wharton character, and that she went, a Henry James character. She went abroad. She traveled abroad quite a lot as a widow, bought her dresses where Edith Wharton bought hers, and so on. So, and she ran a business. She claimed she had little to do with her husband's business, but she kept a fine eye on Galt jewelers, and that's where her money came from, and that's what supported her whole family. But she loathed the suffragettes, and in her own handwriting, that's in her diary. And that's the one thing, my love, that she really brought the issue up several times. She really couldn't stand them. Yeah. Well, his papers are so explicit, they're at his diary is at Yale, and it's finally on microfilm. It wasn't when I was there, but it was kept meticulously day by day by day. And his papers, and I've talked to his grandson. He's right in New York City, on East End Avenue. The person who is enormously helpful is a woman named Judith Schiff, and she's chief archivist at Yale. She is the one who pointed me in the direction of a historian named Arthur Walworth, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his Wilson biography in the 1950s. And I got in touch with him, and I saw his papers were at Yale. Those were a total surprise to me. And he had done the most recent interviews with Helen Bones, with a stenographer, with all kinds of people who were on the spot, and some of them had left records, but none as clear as these. And so those were most helpful to me. And then I just went on from there, and one person sent me to another one. I have thought a lot about it, how little we know about what really happens at the seat of power still, I think. How little we are privy to, how vulnerable people, leaders are. I used to, when I was very small, and not so small, think that they had maybe some charisma, some knowledge, some intellect that was so profound that they would lead us through anything. And now they're just regular folk who happen to have more ambition or energy and land in this seat of enormous power. And one hopes they have enough humility and enough intelligence to seek lots of opinions, because we keep repeating ourselves. And I was astonished to find that in this setup, to prove that Wilson was able to run again to the third term, that a Times photographer and a Times reporter would write it, win a Pulitzer Prize. So you have to examine everything for the story, how strong he was and how well he was. I can't remember the photographer, but the reporter, and his name escapes me, but he did win a Pulitzer Prize because he had the first access to an interview at the White House. So I think that I don't think I'm a skeptic. I think I'm an optimist. But on the other hand, I read everything and then I wonder. I think I wish that some of the fine print had been in bigger print. I wish that the letters that he didn't write were, let's say Woodrow Wilson to so-and-so, and then in parentheses, Joe Tumulty in the top, because I think then it was really dissembling. Or that Edith Wilson had conspired to write with a group of people. I wish that that had been more in the forefront and was in the forefront of those, because if you're a student, if you're running through trying to think it, you take it absolutely as face value. And I think one must always examine. Well, no, I gather that Mr. Bullitt and Mr. Freud did a job on him, but I don't mean that kind of a thing. But I think I'm probably the first person to document what I saw. I think a number of people have suspected that things weren't going well, but I think I've tried with all my heart to not make up I didn't make up any quotes at all. And he was never so popular. That was what was so dismaying when he went, and the English family treated him as royalty. And when he went to Italy, they were just absolutely on top of the world. But he was he had none of the seasoning of a Clemenceau. He was the Premier of France, and then you had, he just didn't understand the trauma that they'd been to and how much they'd been put upon over so many centuries, and he had no gift for compromising of any kind, of listening to people at all. So when you say he kept the flame might have burned stronger earlier, and to more greater fulfillment. Oh dear, I think is a special category. I feel so badly to say that I can't put him there, because just because you espouse an idea, I just don't think it's good enough. I come down on the side of Keynes and of Lodge. It's just not good enough to have an idea when you can't fulfill it, and you might have been able to with a different disposition. Yes, certainly. I give him credit for caring and for being brave enough to go over there and think that he could do something. That was, but the fact that he had no way to get along with these people and no background and understanding, I think, was too bad. And if you realize he didn't see a Secretary of State, he didn't consult with a Secretary of State, he didn't consult with anyone when he was over there. anyone to speak of. And so how could you know what's going on? He sat home in the evenings and with Mrs. Wilson and Ray Stannard Baker and Miss Benham, who became Admiral Helm's wife. And so, you know, which is rather narrow circumstances for to represent the world and take care of the world, you know. Well, on and off for 10 whole years, you know, so it's a lot. And I kept burrowing in and finding things, and the original papers just alarmed me beyond belief. And courting a lady and sending her State Department documents I just wasn't on. If you realize today what was going on, you'd be quite alarmed, I think. One would be. Oh, thank you for having me. Appreciate it very much.